Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we are exploring the beautiful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England, following in the trail of Herbert Evans, who cycled around this region and wrote about his experiences in this wonderful book, The Highways and Byways in Oxford and the Cotswolds, published in 1905, 114 years ago. Here we are today in the beautiful village of Lower Slaughter. We visited here before, but the winter has caught up with us slightly at the end of 2019. So our plan is to start episode 4 of our long compilations of films about the Cotswolds in this little village, and then go eastwards along the Windrush Valley through various remarkable little villages with beautiful churches, on our way to Burford and then on to Whitney. Next year, come the spring, when things are a little bit more friendly in the way of weather, we will head south where Evans did before he went east, but we're going to go next year and look at those wonderful steep valleys down towards Stroud. But on this occasion, we're going to go to Northleach and then all points east towards Whitney. Come with me. The two villages of Upper and Lower Slaughter sit about 2.5 miles southwest of Stow-on-the-Wold and immediately north of Bourton on the Water. The Eye Brook, sometimes known as the Slaughter, flows across the middle of the parish. Lower Slaughter was built around a green, probably larger than the small triangular area that exists today. The stream, broad and shallow where it runs through the village, is crossed by several simple stone bridges. Lower Slaughter is unusual in that the manor has been in one family for 350 years. After the mid-19th century, the Whitmores lived at Manor House, and owning most of the land and being the only leisured family settled here, exerted a strong influence on the life of the local community. Apart from agriculture, trades in the early 1600s provided employment for 3 millers, 2 tailors, a mason and a slater. Milling continued to provide employment, and today Slaughter Mill is run as a mill and a bakery with a shop attached. There was also a malt house in the village from the late 17th century, and an ale house was recorded in 1696. The Church of St. Mary, a building of stone with a Cotswold stone roof, with its western tower and spire, was almost completely rebuilt in 1867 by the Lord of the Manor, Charles Shapland Whitmore. The church contains monuments from the late 17th century to members of the Whitmore family buried in the north aisle. The church has a 6-bell peal, the oldest of which was cast in 1500. Upper Slaughter is one of only 14 villages in the entire country not to have lost anyone in either the First or Second World Wars. These villages are known as the Doubly Thankful Villages. Today, this peaceful hamlet is home to a great hotel called the Lords of the Manor. Not at all far from the Slaughters is one of the most famous of all Cotswold villages, bound to make you feel as if you've stepped into the picture on a box of chocolates. It is Bourton on the Water. Referred to slightly irritatingly in the guidebooks as the Venice of the Cotswolds, it seems it's the fate of anywhere with a bit of a waterway and some bridges to be referred to in such a way. However, there is some justification about this one, because this waterway you see behind me is man-made. It's an extension of the Windrush River, built in order to power some woolen mills in ancient times. It is incredibly beautiful. We're here, of course, very early in the morning in order to avoid the crowds. In this great summer of 2018, probably one of history's greatest summers, the crowds here, of course, are enormous. We're avoiding them by being here early. It is incredibly pretty, and we're going to show you around. Follow me. The name Bourton is derived from a Saxon word for a fort. There's been a settlement here since the Stone Age, but it was the Romans whose road, the Fosse Way, passes the western side of the village, who settled here in numbers. During the Civil War in the 17th century, the area was staunchly royalist, and the King, Charles I, paid several visits. In June 1644, on his way to Evesham, he and his son, the Prince of Wales, stayed in the manor house, while his army camped on what is now the playing fields of the Cotswold School. Within 2 years, however, the final battle of the war was lost in Stow-on-the-Wold, 4 miles down the Fosse Way, and Charles's fate was sealed. In 1660, on the restoration of the monarchy, Thomas Temple, who had been rector of Bourton when Charles I was here, was made Bishop of Bristol by Charles II in recognition of his support for his father. One of the main attractions in Bourton is its miniature village. Built from 1936 to 1940, it's a perfect reproduction of the village of the time at a scale of 1 in 9. It was constructed by builders rather than model makers, which explains the extraordinary detail of the buildings. The walls are constructed of locally quarried limestone, and the roofs are made of miniature Cotswold stone slates. Only the occasional shop sign and window has been altered since to reflect the changes in the village itself. Bourton's growth is largely down to good communications with its neighbours. It had no market in the Middle Ages because it belonged at the time to the Evesham Abbey, which also owned a market at Stow-on-the-Wold, which was closer to the centre of the Abbey's estates. Most of the buildings in Bourton are 17th century, suggesting that before then there were few stone houses. They were almost certainly built of wood. The first alehouse was recorded in the mid-16th century, when the rector of Wick Risington nearby was accused of spending all his time there. But by 1939 there were 6 inns and pubs in the village. These days, tourism is of course a major part of life here, and it's those beautiful low bridges over the mill stream running through the centre of the village that draw people from all over the world. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Bourton on the Water. It isn't by accident this place is so famous and so very much visited by tourists from all around the world. We're now heading due south to the village of Northleach. In medieval times, Northleach was possibly the most important of all the wool market towns. Northleach is famous in the Cotswolds for having been, during the 14th to the 16th centuries, one of the great centres of the wool trade. Behind me you see this incredible church, often known as the Cathedral of the Cotswolds, built almost entirely by the great wool merchants of Northleach, from money made for them by the thriving wool industry. It's a remarkable village, this. It's almost completely classic Cotswolds. It's well worth a visit. We'll show you around. This lovely town has had a roller coaster history. As we've discovered during our journey, this isn't necessarily a disadvantage for us in the 21st century. Many of the villages and towns of the Cotswolds are beautiful partly as a result of their checkered past. Northleach's position, right in the centre of the Cotswold wool territory, gave it a prominence second to none during the medieval wool boom. It saw much of the wealth from trading in raw wool that defines the riches of the Cotswolds. Subsequently, however, it fared a little less well. The road that used to run through it, perhaps the most important east-west highway of all, brought passing trade for the inns and blacksmiths, and brought with it a living for the townsfolk. But when the railways took over in the Victorian era, Northleach was totally ignored and a major decline took place. Even in 1905, when Evans visited this lovely town, things were looking pretty grim. He wrote as follows: Northleach lies on the high road from Oxford to Cheltenham, just to the east of the point where it is crossed by the Fosse, and a turn to the right brings me at once into the centre of the town. I'm afraid there is no gainsaying the fact that the stranger's first impression of Northleach will be that of a desolate, forlorn-looking place. There is no difficulty in finding a cottage to let. The roofs and windows of the less eligible of those are falling in, and I cannot conceal the fact that grass does grow in the streets. But matters are not so bad as they were when Samuel Rudder visited Northleach in the middle of the 18th century. The population was then rapidly diminishing. Many of the houses had fallen down, and the greater part of the rest were going fast to decay. The clearest indication of what this town was like in medieval times is the truly magnificent church, dating mainly from the 15th century. Evans writes, "If you want to get some notion of what Northleach was in the old time, you have only to look at the church. No mere village church in this part of England was ever built on this scale. Like the churches of Fairford and Camden, it was one of those splendid perpendicular edifices that owe their origin to the munificence of the great wool merchants, some of whom are commemorated by their brasses, where they're depicted clad in their furred gowns, their feet resting on woolpacks, sheep, and a pair of shears." The interior of the church resembles Camden in its peculiar arcades, and in its window at the east end of the nave rising above the chancel arch. But unlike Camden, it's been well treated by the restorers, and the painful contrast between exterior and interior which struck us there is absent. Puritan zeal was perhaps not quite so violent here as elsewhere. At any rate, it spared the altars of the two aisle chapels. In 1790, a prison was built in Northleach by one Sir George Onesiphorus Paul. At the time, it was a revolutionary prison design, and it was certainly an example to all. Its design was copied around the world, including in the United States of America. These days, it houses a brilliant cafe, as well as a permanent exhibition of ancient rural machinery and vehicles. We're heading east now, down the Windrush Valley, through several small but stunning villages, and finishing up in Burford. Taking the small lane due north, signposted to Farmington, the road takes us under the big A40 trunk road and up to the small east-west country lane that was, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Evans cycled his way round the area, the main road down the Windrush Valley. As for Farmington itself, Evans writes, "It is a pleasant, well-to-do village embosomed in trees, with a green whereupon 3 aged sycamores shade the pretty thatched and gabled shed which covers the village spring." He's not particularly complimentary about the church, but as we continue east through Sherborne, a beautiful village right on the very river, and on through Windrush itself, we get closer and closer to the village of Burford. Approaching Burford from the west as we are, the first sign of the village is the church spire, peering out above the tops of the trees, giving a clear indication to travellers that they're about to arrive at a place of considerable importance. The serene valley through which the river Windrush meanders is classic Cotswold countryside. The flat meadows on the valley floor, framed with undulating hills which are divided into a patchwork of hedged pastures, perfect for the raising of sheep, for which in medieval times this area was justly famous. The high street dips steeply down to the river and is lined with beautiful buildings. To start with, they are largely residential, stone-built, with the occasional Cotswold gable, set above the street with a tree-lined border on either side, which give way to the broad, ancient market area carefully designed by the medieval planners. It's this street, with its fascinating collection of stone-fronted cottages, shop fronts, medieval alleyways, arches and courtyards, interspersed with large and grand medieval houses that draw so many visitors to Burford from all corners of the world. Between the late 11th and mid-13th centuries, the pattern of Burford streets and house plots were laid out by a succession of local manorial lords keen to exploit the ever-increasing importance of the local wool trade. The high street was marked out, wide enough to hold a market, and plots of land, roughly at right angles to the street. These plots can clearly be seen to this day from the air, and were of a standard width and length so that future development and expansion was possible. It was the market in raw wool for both local and international consumption that laid the foundation of the success of the town of Burford. But from the 17th century, the town started to lose its importance. It became just a small local market town serving its local community. As a result, from that time onwards, the Burford buildings were generally repaired and remodelled rather than rebuilt, leaving the beautiful village we see today. After a brief revival of fortune in the 18th century, as a coach stop between London and Bath, the main east-west road was diverted away from the town, and Burford fell into what must have looked like a terminal decline. And when the railways bypassed the town, it must have seemed like the end. But it was the discovery of Burford by the arts and crafts movements in the 19th century that gave Burford the lift it needed. Led by the highly influential William Morris, this group was a great advocate of the preservation of old towns and buildings, and most importantly of the control of restoration, which so often ruins the very thing it seeks to preserve. Morris set up the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, partly in response to the over-enthusiastic restoration of the church in Burford in the 1870s. The church as it is today is at its core a 12th and 13th century building, sitting in what still feels like a secluded religious enclosure on the northeast corner of the town, with its almshouses and graveyard at its feet. It was in the 14th and 15th centuries, at the height of the wool boom, that the church you see today took shape. In May 1649, the church was the scene of a grim event. The Civil War was over, King Charles I had been executed, but unrest still dogged the new regime. Unsettled by the fact that they were not getting paid and rumours that they would be sent to Ireland, 3 separate regiments of the army mutinied and moved to join up, arriving in Burford on the 13th of the month. In the middle of that night, they were surprised by the arrival of Cromwell's army, and after a short skirmish were captured and imprisoned in the church. 4 of their number were condemned to death, and on the 17th, 3 of them were publicly shot in the churchyard, while the rest of the mutineers, known later as the Levellers, watched from the church roof. The 4th was made to preach to the rest about the folly of mutiny. The parish was left with a very hefty bill for the restoration of the church roof. Nowadays, one of the most beautiful and peaceful churches in the area, the Burford Church of St. John the Baptist, is an essential part of any visit to the Cotswolds. We're going to start our journey up Burford High Street here on the bridge, which is at the northern end. The bridge is first recorded in 1323, but was almost certainly built a little bit before that. It's slightly to the west of the ford, which we mentioned before, which is at the end of the original medieval street, resulting, as you can see, in a slight bend in the road. The house behind me, Cobb House it's called, was lived in at various times by members of the clergy, including in the early 1800s, Edward Philip Cooper, who was a relative of Jane Austen. During the Second World War, the house was used by the armed forces, and then subsequently divided into flats. Finally, in 1958, it was sold by the church, and now it forms 2 rather grand private houses. In 1609, a man called Robert Vesey, who, as those of you who have seen our film on the Bampton Grammar School will know, was a usurer and something of a rogue, settled the house on the site behind me on his sister Anne, on her marriage to Richard Osbaldeston from Chadlington. The existing house was built around 1725 for one John Jordan, to a design evidently strongly influenced by Powys House in Bloomsbury. These days, it's the Methodist Church. There's a record of a house here in 1473 belonging to a prominent merchant called John Pinnick. It was left to the parish in return for an annual mass for his soul. In 1610 it became an inn under one John Sylvester, and the brick facade was added in 1715 by the then landlord William Tash to make it stand out from the other inns in the street. He hoped to draw those 18th century fashionistas travelling between London and Bath. This timber-framed building behind me, set on its octagonal stone columns, is called the Tolsey. It's typical of a range of market houses or town halls found in towns in the area. Its primary function was to collect the tolls from the market traders. And as you can see, it's perfectly situated to look over the medieval market area in the High Street below. Its prominent position at the meeting of Sheep Street and High Street also helped the market authorities stop any unauthorised access to the market. It's interesting to notice that the east-west roads of Sheep Street and Whitney Street were staggered by the medieval planners, where they enter the High Street, in order to control through traffic and ensure no one failed to pay their dues. These days, the top floor of the building is used by the local council for its meetings. We leave Burford by Whitney Street, and declining the ascent to the Oxford Road, keep to the by road in the valley. Through the wide green meadow land, dotted here and there with elm and willow, the Windrush holds its devious course past three of the most primitive villages in Oxfordshire: Swinbrook, Astle and Minster Lovel. First to Swinbrook. Cross the old stone bridge by the mill, and you're soon in the midst of this old-world village. The church, which stands upon the highest ground, strikes you as remarkably tall for its length. To the south and south-west of the church you may see all that is left, just a few remnants of terraces, fish ponds and outhouses, of what was only a century ago a manor house of the first rank. Here the Fetty Places, a family of great wealth and great connections both in Oxfordshire and Berkshire, reigned for 300 years. Though the Fetty Places and the house that they built have vanished forever from mortal ken, their memory is still fresh in Swinbrook. Enter the church and walk straight up to the chancel, and then face north and admire the economy of monumental space. No room in this modest chancel for a series of altar tombs, such as larger churches boast. Yet here no less than 6 Fetty Places recline in effigy, by means of the simple device of placing them on shelves one above the other. There are 2 alcoves, placed side by side, each containing 3 shelves. Now it's obvious that the ordinary supine position would be impossible in such an arrangement. The figures therefore recline on the right side and gaze placidly, for their eyes are open, into space. The Swan pub, down by the river, has a fascinating history and was used in the filming of Downton Abbey. Next we come to the delightful village of Astle, with its beautiful manor house and church and an excellent pub. And finally to Minster Lovel, where the old ruined minster on the edge of the river gives a clear illustration of the grandeur of medieval religious institutions. We will revisit Minster Lovel to tell its story in more detail at a later date. This is Huxley. He's my grandson. He's joined me for the day. This is deeply unprofessional, of course, and Ross has been very patient. But we've arrived in the town of Whitney, which is close to where I live in Bourton. This is a remarkable town. It's extremely beautiful. There's a beautiful church we're going to tell you a bit about in a little while. And it's the last town we're going to visit in this particular episode. It's important because whilst it was, as you can look around you, you can see a wonderful ancient Cotswold village, it grew at the time when the wool trade was changing. The market for raw wool, which had been such a fantastic source of income for all those lovely villages in the Cotswolds that we've seen already, was dying slightly, and the broad loom had been invented. And Whitney became famous for making blankets. And it still is famous for making blankets, although actually the blanket factory closed
a while ago now. We're going to show you around. It's become a busy, very successful little town, this, even after the demise of the blanket business. Everybody uses duvets these days. Partly because of some very enlightened local government. There's free parking here, which has made a huge difference to the way people visit. And we love this town. It's an extremely busy and pretty place, full of great businesses. Let's show you around.
Set around the River Windrush, Whitney is a terrific example of how a medieval settlement can, given the right stimulus and enlightened leadership, develop into a bustling 21st century town. Not only does it boast a hugely impressive church with a 156-foot spire, it was mostly built in the 13th century and is surrounded by a spectacular village green. The high street is full of shops, many of them independent businesses, and there are several pedestrianised lanes leading off the main drag, where galleries, coffee shops and entertainment of all kinds can be found. We will return to Whitney next year to explore it in more detail, but suffice it to say that for those of us lucky enough to live in this area, Whitney is the town in which we shop, eat and drink, and come to watch the latest films. And so the close of 2019 brings us neatly to the end of episode 4. Right at the beginning, we started Evans's journey in Oxford, travelled north through Woodstock to Banbury, west to Edge Hill, and then down the western escarpment as far as Winchcombe. And this episode has brought us back eastwards to Whitney. Next year, we plan to turn south, exploring the steep valleys of the westward flowing rivers of the Cotswolds, visiting villages and towns from Cirencester to Stroud and Painswick to Chipping Sodbury. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we look forward to seeing you there.